everybody. So, it's so good to see you all. Maybe a few more people will show up, I hope. But it's an exciting evening for us because we have Jan Tichy back with us. And I'm sure some of you remember when he contributed to our Moholy exhibition. That was a while ago now, but hopefully a memorable show. He had a major piece in it, if you'll recall. But he's here to talk to us today, not about Moholy, but rather about Moholy, but indirectly, as this talk is really about his first wife, Lucia Moholy. But I'll tell you just a little bit about Jan. He's all over the internet now, so you can find a lot of information online about him. But he teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's a contemporary artist and educator. And his work is at the intersection of video, sculpture, architecture, and photography. He also works with conceptual art and is socially and politically engaged. I'm not going to read his incredible bio in full because he's really been everywhere. He's so active right now. He's done many, many major projects. A few that you'll probably recognize are the project Cabrini Green in 2011, and then in 2017, he did a major project called Beyond Streaming, a sound mural for Flint, Michigan, where he worked with teens to share their experience of the ongoing water crisis. Maybe you remember that. But yeah, most recently, he worked on a 2020 year-long project called Remote Pyramids in Dallas, Texas, which brought together local Latinx teenagers with refugee teens to critically and creatively address issues of migration. So, you can see that Jan is an incredibly creative but also socially responsible artist who's been devoted his entire career to many of the aesthetic ideals associated with, in fact, the Bauhaus, which is kind of where everything starts. So with that, I hope you'll enjoy the lecture, and please help me welcome him to the stage. One little thing I should say, too, and I hope you'll stick around because we have a very special treat for you at the end of the lecture. So I hope you'll plan to stay a bit longer. I'll let Jan describe what that will be. It's a little secret, but a treat.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me. Thank you, Ike, for the introduction. And I'm so happy to... You don't hear? No. Yeah? You're on, but louder, please. Can we go louder? Yeah, is it better? Is it better? Okay, great. So thank you again for bringing me back. And I came back with two things, and one is, as I suggested, a treat that we will see at the end of the program. But there are more treats and things that I'm hoping to bring you as a sort of the first-time audience. I will be talking about the possibilities of contemporary art with the historical research and preservation, something that I have been doing through various projects. Here are a couple of images from my very most recent project at Mike Kelly Mobile Homestead in MoCAD, at McCormick House, at Elmhurst Art Museum. But in a sense, the things that we will be talking about today started in Chicago and with Lighting Crown Hall, a projection on the SR Crown Hall at IIT, the Mies van der Rohe masterpiece, and as a part of larger project Chicago Makes Modern, organized by Mary Jane Jacobs from the School of the Art Institute. But coming to Santa Barbara with the Moholy legacy that we will discuss in a moment also connects to a local legacy. That's an image from exhibition that the museum co-organized with, with Guggenheim in '69. But I was brought back to help and to participate in this exhibition in 2015, The Shapes of Things to Come. And we will see part of the things that took the shape to come. And I also, together with, I created an exhibition that in a way is trying to answer the very same thing, how contemporary art can work within the historical research and preservation, in this case, within the specific collection of your museum. But we won't be talking about it. If you want to know more, you have plenty of it on the website. What I want to talk about is this larger idea of production and reproduction. We will be talking about many different projects of mine and of other artists, but in a way, when you get lost, when I get lost, I want us to come back to this idea of production, reproduction. Idea that Lucia Moholy and her husband Laszlo Moholy formulated in 1922 in Berlin. And I want us to just quickly go through it before we think about the work that they did. They wrote since, and we are talking about 20s, the time when there are so many reproductive media around us, radio, gramophone, and photography, all of these things that are meant to reproduce the media. And they wonder, how can we as artists operate in this environment of reproduction, of mechanical reproduction? We are talking after, after the obviously Industrial Revolution. And they are using a gramophone as an example to ask these questions. They are asking about a gramophone, since its primary production, productive creation that serves human construction, we must strive to turn the apparatuses, all of these things that we have around us, these instruments, used so far only for reproductive purposes, into ones that can be used for productive purposes as well. And then within, for example, gramophone, they call for a profound examination of the following questions. What is this apparatus, this instrument good for? So in a sense of gramophone, that's playing music, right? But what is the essence of its function, they ask? And it is this ability to read the groove in a plastic and translate it to sound. And then, with understanding of these two questions, how can we make it into a creative process? And basically they're saying, if that's the case, so take the plastic and scratch it, create your own groove, and play it, right? Creating the first, in a way, sound music. When I read this article as a grad student in Chicago, my response when thinking about the media that these two artists came from was this video that is starting to think about sound and image and the translation in between them. These images were translated into sound, the same software that is showing us its images. We won't hold there, but that work also led to installation number 6 that you can see a still image here. But that's an installation that the museum just got as a gift from a collection in Los Angeles. And you will be able, at the end of the presentation, we prepare this new installation in a room that you can experience. And these ideas of light and sound and space are part, very much integral part of this installation. And I hope that you will be able also to, to enjoy the installation also through the understanding of some of these ideas and philosophies that we're talking about. As a part of the project back then in Chicago, I was asked to helped to design exhibition of Laszlo Moholy. And within that work, I was allowed to use different materials that came from the estate. Among them, these snippets of films that I eventually made into this new video work that was part of the exhibition here in Santa Barbara, Things to Come. And this work that was also exhibited as a part of the larger Moholy exhibition in Guggenheim brought me a couple of invitations, among them by by a gallery in Berlin that asked me to come and to think about the issues that came up through this work from the Berlin perspective. And when I arrived to Berlin, I sort of realized that there is another person that is part of this narrative that I was looking into. And that was Lucia Moholy. She was a Czech Jew from Prague, secular and leftist Jew, artist, photographer, editor, archivist, writer. And as I see her today, the documentarian. And she was also, for good and bad, the first wife of Laszlo Moholy. But as early as 1930, Lucia had the idea of writing a photo book and began extensive research. And the publication was eventually commissioned by the Penguin and appeared in the series Pelican Specials in 1937. And it was a huge success. The circulation was over 40,000 copies, and it was sold at 6 pence at a piece, which allowed really wide distribution of these ideas. And we're talking about really the first concise history of photography. But when I encountered Lucia in this invitation in 2016 in Berlin, 2016, Europe was in the middle of the European refugee crisis, not the Ukrainian ones, the previous one. And coming to Berlin at that time with millions of refugees flooding the streets, and thinking about Lucia Moholy, that came from Prague to Berlin, and we will look together on some of the Bauhaus parts of her legacy. When she arrives to Berlin, eventually she had to run away in 1933 from the Nazis. This is a video called Lager that I shot while I was working on this project in Berlin in one of the refugee camps. At that time of the crisis, I was also moving between Berlin and Prague, the place where I was born and the place where Lucia was born. And it was a new experience in spatial racism. Czech Republic was at that time and not accepting any refugees, and the xenophobia was soaring. And so this is another neon work, sort of follow up on the one that we saw before, that reflects in a way to the Czech racism. But apart from the exhibitions that I was working in Germany, I tried to understand what Lucia was going through. She was born in Prague to a Jewish family. She left when she was 19 to Germany. And early on, she met Laszlo Moholy. This is a photogram called Laci and Lucia from 1925. It's a photogram of both of their faces, and we will come back to this example. And she joined her husband in his teaching assignments, first in Weimar in Germany and later in Dessau. You probably know this image from the history of Bauhaus. Most of the images that we know from that time were photographed by Lucia Moholy. She was one of the very few people at that time with camera and with the ability to not just photograph but also to develop. And as I was learning about Lucia's Bauhaus legacy, I came across this research by Dr. Robin Childenfry. And she was the first one to fully expose this relationship of Lucia Moholy and Walter Gropius, the architect that built and was the director of Bauhaus at the time when they were in. And the research is looking on the glass plates that Lucia created since the 20s through the 30s, documenting the building of Bauhaus in Dessau. And while she was running in 1933 from Germany, from Berlin via Prague to London, she left behind all of her glass plates that were eventually picked up and literally stolen by Walter Gropius, taken to United States, and used in exhibition like the famous MoMA 1938 Bauhaus exhibitions where Lucia had 26 works, none of them credited. And so these are some of my photograms that I did at that time while researching her work and learning the story, working at the Bauhaus Archive. You can see the use of the red color that appeared on her plates, which comes from this chemical that was used in the 20s to correct exposure on photographic glass plates, and was interesting to me. Lucia eventually sued Walter Gropius, and in 1968 was able to receive part of the glass plates back to Zurich, where she lived at that time. But it was less than half. Out of the 570, there were 330 missing. And you can see the one thing that she took with her when she was running from Berlin was our small archive, Kartothek, where for every glass plate there was a paper card. She was very sort of organized in that sense. And when she received the glass plates back from Gropius, she's sitting in Zurich and marking the ones that they are missing. And so you can see here, negative missing. I was able, while working in Bauhaus Archive, to digitalize all of the cards and eventually creating this small video work that at the exhibition was shown, not that huge as you can see here now, but at the size of the cards itself on a tiny monitor. And it runs through all of her work in a way, all of the 570 cards that she carried with her throughout her entire life. Pausing, slowing down on some of them that we can actually read, but we can't because most of them are lost and we don't really know where they are. And this idea of 330 lost glass plates was strong, and I thought that one way to work around it is to recut the same glass plates because I knew the sizes from the cards, and created this installation number 30, Lucia, from 2016, where there are these 330 empty glass plates, the same number and sizes that were missing, placed on a floor like cards. There was no glue or anything involved, and then exposed and activated with digital light in a similar way that you will see later in the presentation of installation number 6. It's from the same series of works. And based on this work, I was invited by Kunsthalle Praha, which is a new institution in Prague that opened this February with this exhibition that was also looking on some of the important Czech kinetic artists like Zbigněk Pešanek, who was in a way this Czech Moholy that did very similar things that Moholy did in the same years, thinking about light, public space, and other. And Kunsthalle Praha saw my work with Lucia Moholy and commissioned me to create an exhibition that would bring Lucia back home to Prague. And with that, I went on a research that started with this idea of trying to find out the missing plates. And one of the first places we went to was Harvard, where we found around 25 glass plates. That's where Walter Gropius was. And the other was Moholy Estate in Ann Arbor, Michigan, when Hachula Moholy, Moholy's daughter, invited us in and let us look at her collection and finding another 25 glass plates of Lucia. And now, while we were at the collection, there was another thing that suddenly popped up among the folders, and it was this bunch of colorful handprints with some fairly familiar signature. The suite of these prints starts on May 13 with a red brick color handprint of George and L. Muche, the famous painter and architect, and his wife. We knew, of course, that Moholy was using his hands in his art frequently, in photographs in particular, and we see more later. The signed and dated palm prints were surprising nevertheless, and who were also all the people, and for what purpose they did these handprints in the second part of May 1926. Another thing that was in that folder were these horoscopes that also placed this whole folder in a different sort of mode. So who were just a couple of the people behind the prints? Thomas Grote was ceramist, Moholy student in Weimar, and fellow faculty in Dessau. We, for example, have no idea who were these two. They do not come up in the Bauhaus students list. The architect and designer Marcel Brauer doesn't need an introduction probably. Brauer is the only one that didn't sign the date, but you can see in the rest of his career that he was very much aware of his hands. The head of the metal workshop in Dessau, Marianne Brandt, was like Thomas Grote, Moholy student in Weimar. Brandt and Grote, powerful female figures of Dessau era, have probably printed together on May 15. Another Moholy student, Hilde Horn, primarily known as the subject of the series famous photographs Sailing from 1928, printed with Moholy on May 20. The sequence, dates, and seemingly random names might suggest a social interaction diary of a sort. The designer and goldsmith Hans Prinzbill was the last one to make the handprint, in this suite at least, the only one who printed in black. And I will read you a little bit now from Hachula's Moholy Hach text, a little history of the handprints that she wrote for us. She writes, at some point Moholy gave a reddish-brown print with his right hand to Walter Gropius, with a dedication written on it. This handprint is now in the collection of Bauhaus Archive. Moholy kept the other print in the pair, which is interesting because it reveals his deformed left thumb. He has been wounded by shrapnel during his military service in the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I, and his left hand rarely appears in any pictures of him. Moholy left Bauhaus in 1928, and the handprints traveled with him to Berlin, London, and finally Chicago, where he kept them at his school, which came to be known later as the Institute of Design. He died in 26, and then in 1942, Sybil, his second wife, left Chicago, leaving the handprints at the Institute. And then another professor, Emma Ray Pearson, found them and took them with him. And what then happened after Pearson died here on the West Coast, his son sold most of it, most of his art and photography in Sotheby's. And Sotheby's sold the handprints, and that's also where Lucia Moholy was able to hear about them. And so she ran and bought half that wasn't sold. But Sotheby's gave her photocopies of the other half, which was the other half of the hands. It was always the other hand. And so the possibility of digitalization was the first indicator that we can look deeper into these thin lines of history and possibly connecting and adding to it. The Sotheby's 0 copies were in most cases the second hands to the original, providing additional information like the date here, but also the possibility of digital reconstruction, and that this type of line based on monochromatic image seemed to allow. And creating a full color set that could live together again in one place, like a publication, Vasily Kandinsky printing session on May 29 provides additional clues to the story. Kandinsky apparently made several prints that date with the same green color but on a different sized papers. This print, donated by his wife to Centre Pompidou, appeared in Bauhaus' unrelated exhibition the same summer that I was showing these prints in Europe, and it just happened to be. Additional handprint from that day that Kandinsky was printed on a paper with unsigned sketch on the back, a sketch that certainly looks more Moholy than Kandinsky, and therefore might suggest that all of these activities took place in Moholy's studio. And the possibility of reproduction allowed to take this lost project forward and to try to contextualize this research in contemporary art and education setting as the one that was original in Dessau. And I was interested in connecting these histories to the present time and to the Bauhausler for their living counterparts, contemporary artists and educators, and asked if one can be touched by histories and if we can read the future of somebody who has been there before us. And I was interested as an artist and educator in unpacking these ideas with my students and colleagues. And by chance of luck or not, I realized that early 2019, that during the second part of May, again, that's the time that all of these handprints were made in 1926, I will be working with 3 groups of students and starting to think how to connect these. And so one of the ways to work around it was to bring them these reproduced prints and let them try to connect with the Bauhausler of their choice. I then took these prints with me to Italy, to the second workshop, and the students there printed on them. And so as it went through all of these workshops, eventually we got these, what I ended up calling the new originals, these layered prints that I meant initially as a way of connecting to each other, but eventually proved to be really, really beautiful. And I also shared with the students as a present the black and white reproduction of the Xerox copies, for them to work with it and create a new original work that some of them did. Some of them used imagery or stories of their own. You might know that the Dove soap, the very unique shape, comes from Moholy's workshops in Chicago. And the student in Italy staged this performance on the stairs of the school, washing people's hands. Then also working on these on this book during COVID was also very telling. There are a couple of these horoscopes that we found that sort of led me to think about it in the spatial setting, to think about horoscope as a spatial setting was helpful to me as somebody who's not reading horoscopes, but is many times curating space. And so I worked both in Germany, in Kunsthalle Osnabrück, to stage these handprints and these artworks, and later on as well in Chicago, in another Mies van der Rohe building. This is the only church that he ever built, and bringing these back into this setting was also helpful for me to understanding what can be done with these. There were a couple of more exhibitions that put these works and this historical material into different contexts, including historical museums. That helps us to sort of read these things in a different way. And that's the book that I published that brings all of these projects together. We have it in our bookstore at the museum. If you want to look through it, it's available there. And with that, I was invited to spend time as an artist, an artist residency at the place where these things were made in 1926, in Dessau, in Germany. And so I went there primarily to look for Lucia. But among other things, since I knew that since I lived in one of the master houses, I also tried to bring these handprints back, basically as an educational activity that, in a way, I gifted to the educational department there. One of the interesting things that happened while being in Dessau and on the research was something that Robin Schuldenfrei, my partner for that project, found out, that in the municipality archives, found that they actually moved into the studio 2 months later. And so these handprints that I was imagining created in the master house of Lucia Moholy were created in some probably rented small apartment somewhere else in Dessau. We also found in the city archives that everybody else was doing handprints. And we know that, right? We have been doing it ever since we found out that it works on the cave. And so the Bauhaus master houses as a place already was for me placed to work around here. In this installation, you can see the small pecks of the small plates are formed within the installation, as are the master houses in Dessau. And so when I arrived to Dessau, with all of this in a way after me, understanding what happened there to Lucia, to her plates, I was interested to see, first of all, what's happening to me. The exhibition that eventually was called Fensterbilder, like something like window picture, was this is one of the videos that eventually ended up in the exhibition. I was living in one of the master houses, not the Moholy house because it was destroyed, and I will show it in a moment, but in the Schlemmer house, Oskar Schlemmer, another of the Bauhaus masters. And right as I came, right, and I'm coming as a photographer, as a professor of photography, as somebody who's following Lucia Moholy, that at that time was a photographer at Bauhaus, Dessau, and I found myself being photographed because I'm suddenly living in a museum. I'm part of the collection. The Bauhaus, the master houses are owned by the Bauhaus Foundation. They are museum. All the other houses are accessible to public, and there are tours. I arrived in the middle of COVID, 2019, the time where Germany was sort of starting to open. But it was a very strange experience. And I felt it sort of quite immediately, and so I started to take pictures back. In most cases, with my iPhone, just sort of spontaneously. Every time when I saw that somebody is taking picture that I might end up inside of it, I shot back. But it's not anything new. Lionel Feininger, that the American-German painter that was living next door, wrote in 1927, "What is going on here is beyond belief and almost beyond endurance. Crowds of idlers slowly amble along Burghaus Allee from morning to night, goggling at our houses, not to speak of trespassing in our gardens to stares in the windows. Today Moholy was leading a gang in turned-down colors. They stood in front of our house until all were assembled. It's awful to be subjected helplessly to such invasions. I'm developing claustrophobia. It's demoralizing," Lionel wrote. But that's really the first time that we have these huge windows, this new architecture implemented, these part of these Bauhaus ideas. And this meeting of architecture, glass, was very strong to me, already coming with the Lucia glass plates and with all of that. So we won't watch the whole thing. Somehow it ended up 330 images. Again, around the same number of plates that were lost. But as I was staying in this glass house, I also worked in different ways. I turned the house into a darkroom. This is a photogram of all the moths that I found dead every morning under the huge glasses. But what I was interested was sort of this photographic perspective. I constructed cameras obscuras that were the size of Lucia Moholy's cameras, and was looking through these windows out, trying to understand what's happening there with light. And on one hand, turning the master house into a dark room, bring my own childhood enlarger and building a dark room in the basement, but also understanding that these glass houses are light space modulators, something that is crucial to understanding Moholy's, Lucia's, and, for example, Mies van der Rohe, the last director that lived in this light environment. This is the place that eventually the exhibition was shown. That's the Gropius house that was completely demolished during the Second World War. You can see it here on Lucia's picture. I want you to look on these two black columns that are there, that, as you can see here, are not existing anymore. And here's a short film that you can see how the house and the columns looked back when it was built. this is also another picture of the house. But Dessau was a major military city that with a huge military industry, including the industry that created the gas used in the camps. In some strange way, the main Bauhaus buildings were spared the Allied bombings. Gropius's house didn't survive, it's just the cellar. These are the things that were left from the Moholy house. And so after your reunification of Germany, they decided to turn the Gropius's house that at that time looked like a traditional German villa back into what it was. In a way, they asked Spanish architect firm to come up with a proposal. And they built something which is a museum or a gallery that has the same volume of the original space, the same sizes of the walls, of the windows. But as you can see, the pillars there are missing because they are not needed today. And the way that Gropius is writing about them, he made them completely black, as you saw from a black glass, to be sort of reflected that in a way to make them disappear. They found in 2010 in the archaeology dig parts of the glass there and allowed me to work with it and create a photogram of it. And as a part of the exhibition, I also sort of reconstructed these columns, but in a negative, in a silver way. These are a couple of the images of the exhibition. I couldn't see it because I was teaching, it was COVID. So my way of looking at the work was what people were posting on Instagram. And another way of thinking of production and reproduction and experiencing things. The last piece in the exhibition is Hortus Magister, this 35 cyanotype photograms of all the bushes and trees that are part of the Bauhaus Master House's place. It is, again, from their perspective, it's a museum. So every piece, every tree is treated as a museum object, which is interesting as the time goes, obviously. And then you can also see the use of glass plates that are coming from this Lucia installation. And then brings me back to the beginning of the research at the Moholy estate, that we sort of took it a bit away with the handprints, but we did found their plates, and that's actually a couple of them will be the first time that I will share with you. But before we go to the plates, I talked a couple of times about photograms, and these are photograms of plants, and it's in a big glass plates that you can see small plates in it. And so photogram as an idea of a unique object is not really existing here. So there was a reproduction happening from the beginning. In 2018, I created a project called Artes in Horto in Chicago that is accompanied by a website that you can visit, where I also commissioned art historians to think about place of nature within the practices of Chicago artists, one of them obviously Moholy Nagy, and then projected them on the merchandise mart. So the photogram is so central to Moholy Nagy practice and to how he's known. And it's also recognized that all of these were created together with Lucia as the one who operated the darkroom, actually understood the processes, the chemical processes, what's happening there. And so many times Moholy Naj, or Moholy or Lucia, or a couple of times also Man Ray with his rayograms, are sort of considered as the people who invented the photograms. And they were not, photogram has been here a little bit like the handprint ever since. We have been doing in different ways. We also like on our own skin, right? When under the light, under sun, we are changing the color. But Moholy and Lucia actually learned about this technique in Loheland, which was a school and woman community in 1919 in Germany. This is the same year as Bauhaus opens in Weimar. But this is a group of women that are the first ones, as we know, actually in the 20th century, to popularize photogram. Bertha Gunther was creating photograms as a part of a large photographic effort that this commune established next to many different arts and crafts. This is from archive from this summer that documents her life there. It was the first place that actually had dark rooms. Long time before Bauhaus and before, they call it Wagonia, and it's made from railway cars, and they produce their beautiful artwork, both as photograms as well as photographs. I visited there this summer to learn more about Bertha Gunther, that Moholy mentions one without her name, just as the woman from Loheland. To understand, this is one of the photograms that I did there after her. But I wanted to show you a couple of more of the glass plates that we found, and sort of think about also what are they and what do they tell us about Lucia Moholy practice as a photographer, which is one of many, and that's something that I want us to consider today. So as you can see, these are reproductions in many cases, not all. There are portraits, there are photograms. But this is a reproduction as well as this of Moholy's graphic work, and in this case, painting, as well as a documentation of his light space modulator that we also shown here. So that's these are the parts of Lucia creating photography. She was then active as a teacher in Ittenschule, in the school in Berlin, and being the director of the photo department there. Another really interesting thing that came up in our research this summer was this correspondence between her and Itten, proving that she was fired from the school because she was Jewish, without actually mentioning the word Jew. And it was something that we see again and again. After the war, she really started to think about herself as documentarian, offering documentary services. This is her brochure. Look how beautiful it is. And what I found really interesting that it's missing in this list are artists, because she worked a lot for artists. These are the rest of the services. Again, beautiful brochure. But as this documentarian during the war was in London and worked with British military on a new technology of microfilms. And with this knowledge, based and grown of everything that we have seen and heard so far, she went on behalf of UNESCO to Turkey to establish their library system. Here are a couple of images of microfilms, the technology that she helped to popularize and develop. This is some of things from her estate. A couple of other interesting things that coming out from the recent research is, for example, the fact that she knew Hungarian. And so the things that are coming out through the research that we have been doing ahead of the exhibition are also in part because the main place that we have seen some of the materials from Bauhaus Archive before is now closed and not accessible. And that's also part that I, as an artist and educator, find really interesting, being able to let the research to lead me to places that I did not expect. This summer, just a small example, we met Mr. Hoch, Giorgio Hoch, and this is a letter that he shared with us, one of many, where she is explaining him how to print her work for her last solo exhibition, which is a really fascinating document. And she's also allowing him to take portraits of her. Just that you know, you are the first ones that see these. They were never published and never seen, and they are beautiful. And they will be part of the exhibition in Prague. And so the last part of her life she spent in Zurich, in Switzerland, working as an editor, as a writer. Here she's with Angela Thomas, the widow of Max Bill, that was her close friend, and and helped to archive a lot of her estate or a lot of her work. She died in 1989 in Switzerland and is buried there. This is her gravestone that at that moment when I visited her looked like one of the photograms. So with that, I will stop here and will allow for questions. Yeah? Yes?
I'm having trouble understanding what you mean by photogram versus photograph.
I'm sorry. So that's something that we might have went deeper into it. So photogram is camera-less photography, meaning creating photographic image without the use of a camera, only with the use of light-sensitive material. So light-sensitive material, photo paper, if we place something on top of it and expose it to light, it will create the shapes that we have seen, like the hand. So that's a photogram. That's something, as I suggested, we have been seeing around us as a human beings for centuries, being created by sun on us, on our tents, on our clothes. But we had a hard time to stabilize it and to keep the image there. It was Fox Talbot that figured out at the very beginnings of photography how to stabilize the image. And the most famous protagonist of this way of documenting the world around us was Anna Atkins, that used this cyanotype to document the algae around the British Isles. Beautiful body of work. And just in the 20th century, it was Moholy and Man Ray that used these techniques based on these ideas of production reproductions, the way that both of them were trying to push the photographic media to take it apart and see what are the different ways how to create images with these apparatuses when we take them apart, the way that Lucia and him suggested in 1922. Yes.
Did Gropius justify why he took
Yes, yes. He was, it was 1933. Lucia at that time was living with Neubauer, who was the head of the Berlin Communist Party. The Gestapo came to arrest him in her apartment. So she knew that she has to run. She just took a couple of things like the cartotheque and left everything behind. Gropius, it's not really clear if Gropius took it directly from the apartment or Moholy took it from the boxes from there and he took it from him. He was the first one to leave, first to London to work, where for another 2 years he worked with Lucia. Lucia shot for him images of his new buildings that he built in London in 1933, 4, 5, before he moves to Harvard. So the box was somewhere with him. I mean, we don't know. When he showed it in MoMA in 38, so the credit went to Bauhaus and him in a case that his architecture was on it. So there are two things. Both is this claim that it's part of the Bauhaus heritage and it's owned by Bauhaus. And the other is this discussion who owns the credit between photographer and an architect. When living in master houses during the summer, I was in dialogue with the museum of which images, and that was part of the way that how I was taking pictures. Because if I would take pictures of the buildings the way that she did, and for example my gallery wanted to sell it, it would be no from the Gropius Foundation. And so how also, one reason why to work with cameras obscuras that I built and working with different ways of obscuring to see where is the line where it holds. But that's how he argued. Lucia asked him in 1946. She writes him and asking him if he has by chance any of her images that she was asked to give a lecture on Bauhaus in London, and he's not really answering or answering that he doesn't have. And so just when the first catalogs from MoMA from 38 are arriving to Lucia's hands in 1946-7, she realizes that her work has been used, has been published, and from there until 1968 when she gets the 270 back.
So, I think we're going to not take any more questions just because I really want us to go across the hall to be able to experience Jan's piece, which is a promised gift from the Bermans, and you will have the privilege of seeing it before anybody else. Of course, it has been exhibited before, I should add.
Yeah, it has been exhibited the most recently in the exhibition All Monsters at Mike Kelly's Mobile Homestead that we have seen as a part of it for reasons that we will not get into. Yeah, it's part of also a collection of the Israel Museum Jerusalem.